Alberta Premier Danielle Smith invoking the Sovereignty Act for the first time to oppose draft federal regulations. Ottawa is currently negotiating terms with provinces to get the country's electricity grid to net zero by 2035. But the Premier says she won't wait for those talks to wrap, arguing a 2035 target isn't possible for the province, asking for it to be extended to 2050 instead. We spoke with Premier Smith moments after she tabled the legislation last night. Joining us now with the federal response is Employment and Workforce Development Minister Randy Boissonnault. He's the government's sole Alberta cabinet minister as well. Hi, Minister. Good to have you back on the program. Thanks for making the time.
Thanks, Vashti. Always a pleasure.
Setting aside the merits of the Sovereignty Act for just one moment, I want to start with you actually on the genesis of what Alberta is asking for. They want the net zero target for that province to be 2050, not 2035. Yesterday, the Environment Minister said no when asked if that extension was possible. You told me a few weeks ago, though, on the other program, Question Period, that hadn't been ruled out, that, quote unquote, those conversations are happening. Which is it?
So the conversations are happening, and I guess it depends what you're really asking about, Vashti, because if you take a look at the 2035 targets, we have abated natural gas as part of the carbon pricing formula and our overall net zero formula. We already have an exemption for Alberta natural gas, and it goes way past 2035, way past 2040. And so we've already baked that in. And I guess what I find ironic about the Alberta Sovereignty Act, which we can talk about in more detail, is there is a working table at which we are discussing these issues right now. And what is, I can't even write this stuff. It's like a really good fiction novel, but the Premier is invoking a piece of untested sham legislation that's not enforceable to stop regulations that wouldn't come into place for 12 years. So what's the point? And we are doing really good constructive work at these working tables. And Vashti, it's not just about electricity. Minister Wilkinson's been out on this in the public space. It's also about what are we going to do for everything from decoupling emissions growth from actually growing our economy. It's talking about how we're going to grow the province and continue to expand what we're doing, right, heading to a net zero future. So I think the answer is we've got exemptions already in the system, and what the Premier is doing is trying to distract Albertans from some bad calls on her part with this Alberta Sovereignty Act.
Okay, Minister, I just want to be clear, though, on what you're saying, because I think what you mean by exemptions is if natural gas is powering a big portion of their grid, which it is, there are some exemptions already built into the draft regulations that involve using carbon capture to capture those emissions. The Premier contends that is a longer process and a very expensive one and probably can't be done in the next 12 years. My original question to you, though, Minister, was whether or not the government is willing to bend on the deadline. Can you provide us with a yes or no answer?
No, I can't, because those conversations take place behind closed doors. That's why we have a working table. And look, if there was a pathway where we could come to some agreement on how we could actually get to net zero together and would make sense for both our government and the Alberta government, then we would be able to have that conversation in public. Right now, those conversations are taking place where they should take place, which is at the working group. And I think for us both to be clear, and for Albertans and Canadians to be clear, right now, natural gas-fired plants in Alberta are able to contribute to the electricity grid. Because look, we got off of coal, Vashti. Like, we are 7 years ahead as a province getting to our net zero electricity targets. People thought it would take us to 2030 to get there. We're at 2035. And I think what the Premier is doing with the Sovereignty Act is distracting from some bad calls on her part, which is the 6-month moratorium on renewables, which has scared away $12 billion in investment from the province. And she's probably trying to distract from the fact that she's trying to take Albertans out of the Canada pension plan. So she's heading off to COP. I actually think this is what she had to do to keep her base happy, to be able to go to the climate change conference in Dubai. And it's just a massive distraction that isn't going to help a single ratepayer in Alberta with lower electricity prices.
And certainly, look, I take your points on pushing back against the invocation of the Sovereignty Act. I spent over 10 minutes yesterday questioning the Premier on the invocation of that and the effectiveness of it. I wanted to separate that for a moment, because she isn't the only one in the province asking for an extension. And when you say you can't provide a yes or no answer, the environment minister has. Yesterday, he said no when he was asked this question in a scrum following the premier's comments. And prior to that, he also said, carve-outs for provinces prior to the home heating oil debacle, but carve-outs for provinces inherently would not be fair. So are you guys kind of operating off the same page, or should Albertans take from our conversation tonight that the possibility does exist, depending on how these conversations go at the table, for the 2035 deadline to be extended?
Well, we're not going to talk today about extending 2035 deadlines because the conversations need to keep taking place at the working group. And I think you're going to see us as a federal government continue to want to work with the Alberta government. I mean, what we want is a stable electricity grid that is a clean electricity grid, a renewable electricity grid, but also that is going to make sure that Albertans have reliable power. And there's, I think the number, Vashi, from last year's budget is over $40 billion in the 22 budget to make sure that we actually get to a green electricity grid across the country that's 2 or 3 times what we have right now. So I'm going to make sure that the conversations continue at the working table. What I can tell you is that we're going to make sure that we have all kinds of energy mix in the Alberta grid and make sure that it's one that works for Albertans and that gets us to our net zero goals as a country.
Politically, is it palatable, do you think, for your government to be able to say, hey, our climate policy was so important, but we did, because of economic realities, decide to make this carve out for 3 years where home heating oil is concerned, which primarily impacts, because of the portion of consumers who are on home heating oil, Atlantic Canadians. Is it palatable for you to say you can do that and say no to Alberta? Do you understand why Alberta would now be saying, hey, take a look at us and take a look at a carve out over here too?
Look, we can talk about home heating oil as long as you want. And the reality is that the top up that went to folks in rural Atlantic Canada also applies to rural Albertans. They get twice the amount in their carbon rebate, and 12,000 homes in Alberta are heated on heating oil. And I raised this with the Premier when I met with her 3 Fridays ago, and I hope that she joins us so that those Albertans can actually have the same access to home heating, to heat pumps that folks in other parts of the country. But I think the key message here, Vashi, is that there are things built into our climate change program that already benefit Albertans that aren't able to take place in other parts of the country. And I'll say it because I think I said it to you last time we were together. We bought a pipeline. Like, we're building TMX. There is probably no single move we've made as a country that benefits Alberta so singularly. You could throw in the fact that we're going to be able to, there's going to be more money for the Alberta government, more money for Alberta residents when TMX opens up and that pipeline is double. That did no favors to my colleagues in Montreal or BC or even Atlantic Canada. So I think if we actually take a look at
ultimately there are jobs created in all those regions as well from the oil patch, right?
Absolutely. Well, we get great
I understand that Alberta would largely benefit.
Yeah, the whole country benefits from a project this big.
And I'm certainly not trying to take away from that investment, but you're kind of avoiding the substance of my question, which is your government talked about the strength of its climate policy and the need to adhere to it to achieve emissions reductions. You then blinked, right? There was a carve out for a part of the country where you were seeing political support particularly drop. Now Alberta is asking for a similar type of consideration because they feel that the economic needs merit that type of consideration. Is it unpalatable for you to say offhand that they can't?
The conversations are going to continue at the working group, and I think if we actually take a look at what's changed in Alberta based on the announcements that we've made on home heating oil, nothing's changed, Vashi. 8 out of 10 Albertans still get more money out of the Climate Action Incentive Program. Nothing's changed except for the fact that rural Albertans are going to get double top up on their rural top up. So I think if we're talking about the Alberta Sovereignty Act and what Danielle Smith's doing, she's doing it to stave off some decision that's 12 years away from now. We're going to keep having conversations at the working table that Minister Wilkinson has been very clear about. And we're going to make sure that we get to an electricity grid that's going to power Alberta, power Canada. Because look, we also want to grow the province. And when the Premier and I talked, we talked about making sure that electricity isn't a governor for us, that we're able to expand the electricity grid. I honestly think that she's taking this Alberta Sovereignty Act as a way to distract from bad ideas and to just pick a spat with the federal government that doesn't need to be picked, because we have the working table and it continues to unpack these issues behind closed doors, which is where we actually have to do these works, because we're looking at detailed information, detailed models, and that working table will continue.
Okay, Minister, I'm out of time. I know your time is limited too. Thank you very much for the conversation this evening.
Thanks, Vashi.
Thank you.
All the best.